Okay, friends, everyone listening, everyone seeing me, this is our 10th event already to focus on femicide. We are extremely privileged in the conditions of COVID to be here in the Permanent Mission and Embassy of Mexico. We have excellent facilities and excellent staff and a wonderful ambassador who has served in many continents. He has been ambassador in Kenya, he's been ambassador in Norway, and he's been ambassador in Austria now since June of 2020. So we are extremely grateful that Mexico is leading this campaign against the killing of women and girls. So I'm going to turn it over now to Ambassador Campuzano. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michael Platzer. But let me start by rendering homage to every person and entity engaging on the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence against women and girls, and by expressing our deepest appreciation to the organizers of this podium. In due time, I will introduce our distinguished panelists in this event. Bearing in mind the urgency of tackling femicide with our panelists and with you, the participants of today's podium, we'll have an in-depth practice-oriented exchange of information on the implementation of international standards on femicide and psychological violence, and on the establishment and the operation of femicide watches. Since its launching in 2015, several observatories have already been established, including in 2018, the Observatorio Ciudadano Nacional del Feminicidio in Mexico. Yet, we are far from the objective of having in all countries multidisciplinary national bodies for working actively on preventing gender-related killing of women. More worryingly and shamefully, we're even far away from our main objective of reaching a point in which this kind of bodies are not needed because we have been able to eradicate femicide. It's not a dream or a simple aspiration, but a goal that has to move us. Sadly, the current figures show how much is yet to be done, especially when realizing that the number are largely underrepresenting the real occurrences of attacks and killings against women, a reality that is even worse and more challenging in the case of psychological violence. And this situation has only and will only be worsened with the lockdowns imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Hence, there is a greater need than ever for improving data collection on cases of violence against women, especially femicide and psychological violence, and adopting and implementing effective policies to address and eradicate those heinous acts, which cannot be justified in any place or by any circumstances based on cultural, social, or religious beliefs or practices. Criminals have to be brought to justice, and societies have to be allergic to all crimes against women. The task is daunting. Violence against women and girls is multi-causal and multidimensional. Women and girls suffer diverse types of violence in all areas of their lives, which reflect acts of discrimination associated with persistent patriarchal practices in all societies of the world. Therefore, its approach, treatment, and eradication entail important challenges derived from its complexity and its multiple manifestations. The health emergency of COVID-19 represents a global challenge in terms of health, economy, well-being, social cohesion, and human rights. Wrongly, though the pandemic and isolation measures have been having a greater impact on women and girls. The figures worldwide are extremely worrying, as they show the reality in which many women and girls live, the challenges that we still have to overcome. For example, UNICEF reported that 36% of women aged 20 to 24 worldwide were married or living with a partner before their 18th birthday, and that 30 million girls are at risk of being victims of genital mutilation in the next decade. WHO estimates that 30% of women worldwide have suffered physical and/or sexual violence at some point. And if current trends continue, more than 14 million girls and adolescents will be married each year before their 18th birthday. In Mexico, it's believed that at least 6 out of 10 women have faced an incident of violence. More than 40% have been victims of sexual violence, and its most extreme form, 9 are murdered a day. The feeling of insecurity continues to rise, including within their households, which in many cases are not the sanctuaries for them as they should be. This is why my government has implemented measures and actions to guarantee gender equality and human rights, addressing this health contingency with a gender perspective, and bearing in mind that all the life cycles of women are marked by discrimination for reasons related to gender and inequality, and that only an intersectional approach to contingency will help to combat it and recover from it. Addressing all its causes and consequences, as well as achieving substantive equality between men and women, is a priority for us. With that objective, we have built one of the most comprehensive legal, programmatic, and institutional frameworks in the region, taking into account the multifactorial nature of violence against women and in line with our international commitments. The actions that Mexico implements on gender issues in the context of COVID-19 can be classified into 5 areas. First, prevention and care of violence against women. Second, distribution of domestic and care work. Third, leadership and empowerment of women. Fourth, sexual health and sexual and reproductive rights. And fifth, other health and social protection services. As part of the actions undertaken, I would highlight the following: training personnel of the 911 service to attend properly complaints related to gender violence, establishing an emergency number to deal with acts of gender violence in all 32 states' institutes for women, developing a guide for adequately responding to situations of family violence against women and girls, preparing a directory of women's justice centers, and encouraging the 32 judicial branches of the states to adopt measures for the protection of lives free from violence and access to justice for girls and women. Among the relevant policies and initiatives adopted by my government, I would highlight the Plan Nacional de Desarrollo 2019-2024, the Ley General de Acceso a la Violencia, de acceso a las mujeres a una vida libre de violencia, Proigualdad 2020-2024, Programa Integral para prevenir, atender, sancionar y erradicar la violencia contra las mujeres, el Sistema Nacional de Prevención, Atención, Sanción y Erradicación de la Violencia contra las Mujeres, el Plan Emergente para garantizar la integridad, la seguridad y la vida de las mujeres y las niñas en México, mesas técnicas de acceso a la justicia para las mujeres y las niñas en caso de muertes violentas, Carta Compromiso para la incorporación de las mujeres a los procesos de paz y para la eliminación de la violencia contra las mujeres, niñas y mujeres en México. This is between Mujeres and the Secretaría de Seguridad y Protección Civil. Then the Grupo Interinstitucional para atender la violencia contra las mujeres, the Spotlight Initiative, and the Casas de la Mujer Indígena y Afromexicana. And regarding our collaboration with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, here in Vienna, let me highlight 3 issues. The establishment of the Center of Excellence in Statistical Information on Government, Crime, Victimization, and Justice as joint venture between UNODC and the INEGI, that's Instituto Nacional de Estadística y Geografía. The establishment of a gender unit at the Liaison and Partnership Office in Mexico of UNODC, the first unit of that nature ever being established. and our involvement with the group of friends on gender of UNODC. I have indicated just some of the policies and actions being implemented in my country, aware of the challenge being faced. Yet, and as mentioned beforehand, we are far from an acceptable situation. We cannot put our hands down until the day in which we are able to eradicate all violence against women, including psychological violence. Apologizing for such a long introduction, and without further ado, I will give the floor to Ms. Karin Bruckmüller and Dr. Michael Platzer for the welcoming remarks of this event. Please, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction and a warm welcome from our side, from the Sigmund Freud Private University. We are really very sorry that's an online welcome and that we are not allowed to open the university for this event and for the guests. We, the Sigmund Freud Private University, are quite young university with different faculties. The faculty of psychology, of psychotherapy, the medical faculty, and the one of law I'm coming from. And all these mentioned disciplines and the interdisciplinary research of these fields are very important and fruitful for the topic we are talking today for our event. We have the aim to prevent violence and therefore to prevent victims of violence. And it's still very important to do awareness raising. It's still needed in this field, and therefore the Sigmund Freud Private University is very glad to be part of this event. I don't want to use more time because I think it's very important that we have the presentations and that we can bring this topic and the awareness raising to all of you. Thank you very much.
I think my task here as the old historian I was there at the beginning when we started this campaign, and we introduced resolutions in the General Assembly successfully to get UNODC started. But I remember the office in Mexico was one of the first to join the campaign. But we were also, I'd like to remind us that Diane Russell, who was a leading feminist of the activist in the 60s, sort of invented the term femicide for the English-speaking world. I know in Spanish it already was common to refer to the misogynist killing of women and all manners of violence against women, including rape, incest, child abuse, battery, pornography, and sexual harassment. So we expanded the definition greatly. What we will be talking about today as well is the effect on children. When mothers are attacked, there's always a psychological damage done to the child, and perhaps even permanent damage. And this was brought home to me by one of our distinguished panelists up there. So I will also be short now, only to express our gratitude again to Mexico, to UNODC, who've been our partner now for over 10 years, and to all the other ladies I see up there on their screen. We thank you all for keeping up. I see that Jean and Linda are waving, our friends from Canada. And this is a wonderful experience with so many people from different continents. So I will shut up and we will move on now to a substantive discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Platzer. Now we're moving to the presentation, and the first one would be the video from Alma Zadic. Jeremy will play the video, but I will introduce first Ms. Zadic, Minister Zadic. She's a Bosnian-born Austrian lawyer and politician of the Green Party. She has been serving as Minister of Justice since 7th January 2020 in the governments of Chancellor Sebastian Kurz and later Alexander Schallenberg. Originally from Tuzla in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Alma studied law at the University of Vienna and at the Columbia University in New York. Before entering politics, Zadic worked for 6 years as senior associate at the Vienna office of London headquartered multinational law firm Freshfield Bruckhaus Beringer, specializing in human issues. Now we will have this video.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted for having the opportunity to address you on the occasion of today's podium discussion on tackling the major issue of femicide on a global level. Unfortunately, I will not be able to participate in person this evening. But violence against women in its most extreme form, femicide, is a tragic global phenomenon. The concept note of today's podium discussion mentions one method to prevent femicide, namely the collection of comparable data on violence against women at the global, regional, and national level, in order to better inform decision makers, practitioners, academics, and of course the civil society. I of course agree with this view, in particular because Austria has ratified the Istanbul Convention, which also obliges us to collect relevant data on a regular basis. Effective political measures need to be based on solid, reliable, and comparable data. And as a first step, it was therefore important, particularly to improve the data situation regarding domestic violence in Austria. As you are all aware, domestic violence is very often the harbinger of femicide. Therefore, we need to find a coherent definition of domestic violence to close the existing data gaps. Based on this definition, comparable scientific work can commence, which will then form a basis for better prevention mechanism. Therefore, we have surveyed all murder cases of women and children since 2016. As a first step, the public prosecutors and the Department of the Federal Ministry of Justice identified 140 relevant cases. We identified the following questions for analyzing those cases. Were there any abnormalities in the previous life of the perpetrator? What was the relationship of the perpetrator to the victim? And were there already convictions? With this survey, we want to provide the public prosecutors with a tool to better recognize risk factors. Austria will therefore soon have data to share on gender-related killings of women, which will help us to implement effective measures for preventing femicides. Another topic of today's podium discussion is the lessons learned from existing efforts to combat femicides and psychological violence. In my view, effective prevention can only be achieved through regular exchange of information. And this is true for every case conference, enabling the police and NGOs to protect together a single victim of domestic violence from further harm. Moreover, this is also true for today's podium discussion. Therefore, I wish to thank you for organizing such an outstanding forum for structural and constructive dialogue. I wish you every success and a productive exchange.
We thank very much Minister Zadic for her words and for the important task being done by Austria in this regard. Now I have the pleasure of presenting Elena Contura. I hope I pronounce it correctly. She's a member of the European Parliament for Greece. She is appointed coordinator of the Left Group at the Transport and Tourism Committee and member of the Committees on Women's Rights and Gender Equality, FEMM, Industry Research and Energy, ITRE, and Artificial Intelligence, AIDA. As member of the Greek Parliament from 2004 to 2019, she has been appointed secretary to the Standing Committee on Monitoring the Decisions of the European Court of Human Rights and member of the Greek Parliamentary Assembly at the Council of Europe, PACE. Ms. Contura has served as the European Parliament Rapporteur on the resolution on the impact of intimate partner violence and custody rights on Women and Children, adopted by a large majority on October 6, 2021. So you have the floor.
Thank you so much, dear all. I would like to thank you for the invitation to join you in this event held on the eve of the International Day for Eliminating Violence Against Women, and also to commend you for your commitment in addressing all the adversities that women victims of violence endure and your work towards bringing the change so much needed. To this end, I will briefly touch upon critical issues that I have addressed through my initiative report as a rapporteur of the European Parliament on the impact of intimate partner violence and custody rights on women and children. As you may know, the report was adopted with vast majority by the European Parliament in October's plenary, and has been submitted as a resolution to the European Commission to be taken into consideration in its upcoming directive for combating gender-based violence in the EU. With this progressive groundbreaking report, the European Parliament, for the first time, focuses not only on women, but also on children that they have been impacted either as victims themselves or as witnesses of such violence. We call on the European Commission and all member states to adopt a holistic European framework in support of the fundamental right of every woman and child to a life without violence. Intimate partner violence is a serious, often long-term and hidden social problem that causes systematic physical and psychological trauma. The consequences are grave for the victims, with a severe impact on the emotional, economic, and social well-being of the children and the whole family. And as we all know, the statistics are extremely alarming. 1 in 3 women has been the victim of physical or sexual abuse. 1 in 5 has been abused by her partner or ex-partner. But 2 out of 3 do not file a complaint because of the fear, the shame, the blackmail, even the threats for their lives or their children's lives that they received from their abuser. Other obstacles they face are due to the lack of trust in the authorities that they turn to for help, and also their economic dependency. Women victims will be forced to stay with the abuser because they have nowhere else to live and zero income for themselves and their children. Still, when they find the strength to get away, the violence might not stop even after the separation. During the pandemic and the lockdowns, domestic violence increased sharply as women and children found themselves in confinement at home 24 hours a day with their abuser. In some member states, reported incidents increased even by 60%. While other reports show that even when lockdown measures were lifted, the abusers reacted even more violently because they lost the control they had gained. And this is reflected in the growing list of femicides and infanticides across Europe. The pandemic has highlighted distortions and legislative gaps that pre-existed in addressing the full spectrum of domestic violence, and especially in matters of custody. With my report, we ask foremost that the Istanbul Convention be swiftly ratified and implemented by all member states that have not yet done so, but also by the European Union as the first binding international legal text for combating gender-based violence, for prevention, and for the punishment of perpetrators. We urge the Commission also to include gender-based violence in the Eurocrimes list and to use this as a legal base to propose binding measures, and a holistic EU directive to prevent and combat all forms of gender-based violence. We also call on the Commission and the Member States to ensure adequate and universal access for victims to structures and support services, and to tackle financial violence against women, including access to housing income and faster payment of benefits such as child support. We stated the need for specific programs for the perpetrators with the aim of changing the patterns of violent behavior, as well as for a permanent mechanism that must be established again against gender-based violence in times of crisis, such as the pandemic. Child abuse is a key criterion in determining custody. Yet, in cases of intimate partner violence, it is often ignored in several member states. The trauma experienced by the child is often underestimated during the judicial proceeding. So is the risk for the child and the mother to be repeatedly abused. This is why in my report, the European Parliament stated clearly that the failure to recognize and address incidents of intimate partner violence in determining child custody and visitation rights is a violation of the right of women and children to a life without violence and is incompatible with the best interest of the child. The protection of women and children from violence and the best interest of the child must be paramount and should always take precedence over other criteria when establishing the arrangement for custody and visitation rights. And when the mother is a victim of violence, we consider that she should be granted full custody and that custody and visitation rights of the abusive partner should be revoked, as this is the only way to protect her from further violence and secondary victimization. Both parents must indeed participate actively in the life and upbringing of their child, but not if it is against the best interest of the child. In any case, the European Parliament opposed to mandatory shared custody because its case must be ruled individually based on what is the best interest of the child as defined in the International Convention on the Rights of the Child. Even more in cases with history or even an indication of violence, shared custody decisions should be postponed until adequate investigations and adequate risk assessments have been carried out. Shared custody in situation of intimate partner violence exposes women to a continuum of preventable violence by forcing them to stay in geographical proximity to their abusers and subjecting them to further exposure to physical and psychological violence, as well as emotional abuse, which can have a direct or indirect impact on their children. Moreover, ill treatment of children by perpetrators is often being used to exercise power over and commit acts of violence against the mother victim of violence. A further concern is the so-called parental alienation syndrome and similar concepts and terms. The scientific community does not recognize such terms and criticize them strongly. Still, they are often being used by the abusive fathers in the context of intimate partner violence as a strategy against the mother victim of violence, putting into question her parental skills, dismissing her word and disregarding the violence to which children are exposed. This is why in my report, the European Parliament firmly rejects the use of this pseudo syndrome and calls on the member states not to recognize it in their judicial practice and law, and to discourage or even to prohibit its use in court proceedings during the investigations to determine the existence of violence. For these reasons, we consider that custody and separation cases should be adjudicated exclusively from special courts and judges with the support of specialists such as forensic doctors, psychologists, child psychologists, and pediatricians. Training must become mandatory for all personnel in the judicial system, in law enforcement, in forensic medical services, and healthcare professionals in relation to all forms of violence and its mechanism in handling such cases. It is unacceptable that we mourn the loss of women and children because the competent authorities fail to recognize the risk and react timely. Finally, as we state in our report, I would like to point out the need to support activities in schools and other settings for raising awareness of crime and trauma issues, on where to seek help or report such crimes, and how to build resilience among children and those working with children. In every strategy regarding prevention against intimate partner violence, action must be included that reduce exposure to violence during childhood and eliminate all forms of sexism and gender stereotypes. The culture of inspiring respect towards human rights and for every human being, regardless of their gender, is the only way of creating healthy relationships and prospects for true progress in our societies. Thank you.
On the contrary, thank you very much, Parliamentarian Contura, for your very, very important and interesting participation. I would like to highlight to all that are viewing this podium that in the chat there are some links to the Ms. Elena report and also to the resolution. So you want to take a look, there's this possibility. Now we will have the presentation by Mirela Dumars. Her presentation will be on why violence against women matters for Unodc. Mirela Dumar-Frahi is the chief of the Civil Society Unit at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC. In 1989, she joined the United Nations, starting with the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA, and followed by the United Nations Drug Control Program, UNDCP. Since 2008, she has led the UNODC Civil Society team and is currently responsible for a large program, engaging civil society on drug control, the implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC, and the UN Convention Against Transnational Crime, UNTOC. She oversees, among other projects, the UNODC Anti-Corruption Project for Civil Society in Southeast Europe, entitled Southeast Europe Together Against Corruption, implemented and in partnership with the Regional Anti-Corruption Initiative, RAI. Ms. Dumar, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Ambassador Campuzano, dear friends, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you, although I was hoping to be in the Vienna University, but we know that Vienna is in lockdown, so I am at home. But I really wanted to be here with you because of the importance of the subject matter. I am not the expert and I am not allowed even to give you any data, considering UNODC will launch its publication tomorrow on gender-related killing of women and girls in the sphere, in the private sphere. So we will ensure that you have the link tomorrow. But for me, it was important to be here representing civil society organization to tell you about a story, to tell you about Nadine. Nadine had a shop very close to my street. I live in Vienna, in the 9th district, Nussdorfer Straße. She had a small shop, and she was killed actually by her partner. He put fire on her shop, locked her inside, and she could not survive. She died in March 2021. Her story is probably the story of many women who are killed by their own partner. In Austria alone, the toll of femicide in 2021 has reached 27, as reported last Monday by the media. Last year, Italy, because I'm Italian, and our president, Mattarella, named one by one the 120 victims of femicide in Italy. So it's important to speak about these victims, especially because they are no longer here to testify. And we can do something to prevent this violence. We have to do something. What I can tell you a little bit about what UNODC is doing to address gender-based violence. Of course, there are many soft laws, and Michael was mentioning before some resolutions that were adopted at the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. Therefore, since 2010, UNODC has been supporting countries to ensure that gender-based violence is addressed in a victim-centered manner. For example, UNODC builds the capacity of member states for the collection and analysis of relevant data involving gender-based violence, including victimization surveys and data collected by police, prosecution service, and the judiciary. It conducts also assessment on national laws, policies, and strategies, as well as their implementation by the different parts of the criminal system. COVID-19 has obviously exacerbated the situation. We all know that home has become one of the most dangerous places to be for many women. As part of their responsibility, UNODC has also updated the programs. UNODC has updated its program and initiatives to respond to the increasing demand for essential police and justice services by women survivors of violence. In 2020, UNODC conducted a global assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on criminal justice system response to gender-based violence against women, as well as a research brief about the impact of the pandemic on these reported cases and hotline data. Let me give you two examples in two regions of the world, Africa and Central Asia. In Africa, UNODC and UN Women's had a joint project in Liberia, Senegal, and Sierra Leone, to enable civil society and local stakeholders to provide legal aid services to survivors of sexual and gender-based violence in response to the increased demand during the COVID-19. In Kyrgyzstan, UNODC supported emergency mobile group of police officers, health and social workers, psychologists, providing essential services during the COVID-19 related lockdown. In addition, UNODC has a number of technical assistance tools that I see my colleague Billy Butterware is adding on the chat. Thank you, Billy. And UNODC offers a wide range of technical assistance and advisory services to enhance criminal justice response to violence against women. And again, here, my colleague who works directly on the subject couldn't make it today, so I'm trying to cover it. And I would like probably also to give from the work they do 2 examples based in Latin America, starting in Mexico, to thank also the ambassador to host this meeting. In Mexico, UNODC under the Spotlight Initiative has sponsored 5 civil society organizations, including Educar Uno, self-managed course on remote care for survivors and course for the management of geostatistical data on violence against women and girls, Circo Azul, with communicational spots on nonviolent masculinities, Decasol, podcast for the prevention of violence against women and girls, the Universidad Iberoamericana in Ciudad del México through diploma course for civil servants who provide service in the prevention, care, and punishment of gender-based violence, and Empathetis, which is an evaluation specialized diploma course. And of course, the observatories that Ambassador has mentioned, which are very important to provide reliable data and evidence on the crime happening. Another example, Bolivia, where UNODC engaged with an NGO to develop a self-training course for police officers on police action in case of violence against women and the family, organize an exhibition on equality and gender perspective jointly with Universidad Privada de Bolivia, and partnered with many civil society organizations in the development of a course on journalism with a gender perspective. Engaging civil society, including faith-based organization, on femicide observatories and psychological violence against women, especially mother, is crucial. Therefore, I'm very pleased to be here to give all this example of the importance of engaging with civil society, and allow me, if I move also to what my unit work does, especially, which is more related to transnational organized crime, and we work with NGO, academia, the private sector to address and prevent organized crime, building capacities, and making sure that civil society is ready to engage in a constructive dialogue with member states during the working group of the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, and to participate meaningfully in the review mechanism of this convention. If some of you are not yet part of our stakeholder database, What's On, again, the link has been added. Please have a look, submit an online form. We would like to have as many stakeholders as possible from all the region and the field. Again, the civil society unit is very keen to build bridge and bring the voice from the field. So we hope that the observatories that you are envisaging will be a useful tool for this purpose. I thank you very much for the attention.
We thank you very much, Mirela Dumas, for your presentation, as well as for all the different links that you have provided us through the chat. And it's also very, very tough when you experience directly one of these cases. Thank you for sharing it. And I think that this is what usually makes even much more near the need to really act in this case. So thank you very much. Now we will present Barbara Bruckmüller. She will focus on violence in the time of a lockdown, and she will talk about what we do or do not know about how social distancing and stay-at-home policies intensify different forms of violence, and present findings from 2 empirical studies on the transformation of intimate relationship in the COVID-19 pandemic. Ms. Barbara Bruckmüller is a sociologist of the Faculty of Psychology, Sigmund Freud University, Vienna, with expertise in gender, intimacy and sexuality studies, social inequalities, and unintended psychological consequences of pandemic mitigation strategies. Ms. Barbara Bruckmüller, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here and be part of this very important initiative. I'm happy to present a few findings on the topic of how COVID-19 shutdowns impacted psychological violence against women. So what do we know or not know about violence during a shutdown? Already at the beginning of the pandemic, there were huge concerns that isolation and stress related to the pandemic will increase the incidence of violence against women. Also, we know from previous disasters that violation of women's rights are really a problem. Also, specialized intervention centers reported an increase in calls and counseling requests of women who experienced different forms of violence. Yet, little cohesive data on how stay-at-home orders impact different forms of violence against women and children are available. I want to present a few findings from a study that I conducted in Austria and Germany during lockdown 1, that was in April 2020, and in the second lockdown, November-December 2020. It was an online survey that addressed transformations of intimate relationships during the time of a lockdown, and also related to general social distancing and mitigation strategies. So the questionnaire included topics such as psychological violence and also a possible increase of conflicts in households, among other topics. Before I give you a few, present you a few findings, I just want to say a word about limitations. So because it's an online survey, it's not a representative survey, it has a sample bias similar to almost every online survey that is conducted, and that is that mostly highly educated women participated in the survey and are thus overrepresented in the sample. So in terms of psychological violence against women, I asked in the study, in the last 2 weeks, have you experienced psychological violence in your intimate relationships? For example, being controlled, threats, verbal abuse, and similar experience. Overall, 1 in 10 women who were at the time of the study in a committed relationship said yes, they experienced at least once, and some of them even several times, one of these forms of psychological violence in their intimate relationships. In terms of household cohesion, particularly now looking at lockdown 2, I asked if the atmosphere in the household is negative and frequently escalating. And it's very interesting to look at different groups of women, because there you will immediately see a few risk factors that are affecting the atmosphere in intimate relationships. For example, women who are living with friends in a shared flat, among those women, only 8% report that they were experiencing some tensions in the second lockdown. But already, if we're looking at women who are living with their partner in the same household, they're already 15% reported that, well, the atmosphere was already starting to get negative at the beginning of the second lockdown. and it even increases if there are children in the household, and even more so if women are living in living conditions where they do not have a room or a place where they can be on their own, at least for a certain amount of time. And in respect of relationship conflicts, we found that 1 in 4 women reported that they experienced an increase in intimate conflicts in lockdown 1 and in lockdown 2. I just want to draw your attention to the fact that some women also experienced a decrease in conflicts in their intimate relationships, particularly during lockdown 1. And that is really interesting because I looked into the data and also open-ended text-based answers to understand why there was such a huge amount of people that experienced a decrease in domestic violence or relationship conflicts. And it's mostly due to a temporal reduction in work-related stress, also sometimes recreational stress, if you want to call it like that. People, at least some women, might also have experienced a decrease in conflicts, but as you can see, it already went down to only 40% in lockdown 2 in my sample. So in terms of risk factors, what do we know? What are the risks that increase psychological violence against women during a lockdown? So on the one hand, there are social factors, for example, an increase of conflicts and negative atmosphere. Then there are relationship factors, of course, being in a committed relationship and particularly in a separation is a high risk factor for escalating conflicts and violence. But there are also socioeconomic factors, for example, job loss or financial worries during the pandemic that affect psychological violence. And I have already mentioned that also restricted living conditions where there's no place to be on your own might also have a negative impact. So what do we not know about violence? There are several limitations. There are no representative and cohesive data collections on violence. It's very interesting to look to Germany because their representative study found no significant difference in the prevalence of violence among the German population before and during the pandemic. It was a comparison of 2016 and 2021. So how can we make sense of the data that we have so far in Germany and Austria? I would say that in some countries like Austria and Germany, it's very likely that we are not facing a higher prevalence, or not necessarily, but an increased intensity of conflicts and violence in households with multiple stressors, as I said, financial worries, job loss, and so on, and the preceding history of violence. And finally, I want to draw your attention to the fact that the consequences of domestic violence and psychological violence are severe, also on children who have to witness violence in their families. So, for example, domestic and psychological violence can increase the risk of internalizing and externalizing disorders such as depression and aggressive behavior. It has already been shown also for the time of the pandemic that it's negatively affecting the children. We know the children and adolescents are really suffering a lot already during the time of the pandemic. So what they need is more support, and I think it's very challenging actually to tackle social isolation in times of social distancing. We are just at the beginning of the next lockdown in Austria and Germany, and I'm not sure if we have already developed good concepts of how to support particularly children and adolescents in violent households. Thank you very much.
On the contrary, Barbara Bruckmüller, thank you very much for your presentation and the very important database that you are providing for the consideration of all the podium. So Now I will give the floor to Dr. Thomas Beck, who will talk about the effect on a child witnessing domestic violence, including psychological violence against a primary caregiver. Dr. Thomas Beck is a clinical psychologist at the University Hospital in Innsbruck with extensive experience in the treatment and diagnosis of patients with acute and complex trauma disorders. For many years, he has also been active in the protection of victims of domestic violence. In this context, he founded the Victim Protection Group at the University Hospital Innsbruck and currently leads this group. Dr. Thomas Beck, you have the floor.
First of all, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to present some reflections on the topic of children as witnesses of domestic violence. Let's start with a few general considerations. What is actually understood by domestic violence? By definition, domestic violence is any form of violence that occurs between people living in the same household. This is actually independent of family relationships. No distinction is made as to what form of violence is involved. It doesn't matter if it's physical, sexual, or psychological violence, or even all finite mixed forms. Unfortunately, domestic violence usually becomes more intense. For example, the intervals between violent assaults become shorter, and in most cases the violence also becomes stronger and worse. At this point, allow me a brief digression into the topic of trauma and attachment. In many cases, the experience of domestic violence and also the mere witnessing of it are traumatizing events, especially for children. Especially for children, relationships with adult caregivers are of utmost importance. They are both physically and psychologically existentially dependent on them. In order to maintain relationship with caregivers or to give them a chance to exist, some children even stop their development. So completely after the thought, if I am smaller and younger and more needy, then they will certainly take care of me. Especially harmful in this context is abuse, even observed by close caregivers. It is also known that disorganized attachment and relationship behaviors is passed down through the generations. Children virtually adopt their parents' relationship model as their own, even if they have only observed it. So what are the implications of witnessing domestic violence? Martin Taisha, one of the leading researchers in the field, recognized far-reaching neurobiological consequences from witnessing domestic violence. In general, he talks about how witnessing domestic violence leads to a stressful flooding of the brain. Most importantly, it reduces neural connections between the visual cortex and the amygdala. This has far-reaching consequences. There is a marked impairment of emotional and memory responses to things seen, things observed. This impairment has a strong negative impact on the social and emotional learning of those affected. This in turn has led to an increased incidence of depression, anxiety disorders, and somatization disorders. In addition, hippocampus and amygdala overexcitation occurs. On a symptom level, this overstimulation then leads to the development of anxiety, depression, eating disorders, somatoform pain disorders, aggressive behavioral disorders, and also cognitive performance impairments. What consequences does Martin Taisha draw from his neurobiological findings? Witnessing domestic violence floods the brain effectively with a massive overload. With the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the limbic system, the areas in the brain responsible for memory, for example, the distinction between the present and the past, as well as the emotional and affective reactions are activated. As a direct result, much free fluctuating anxiety is generated, which in turn leads to the inability to use cognitive functions in a concentrated manner. The direct consequence of this is a significant reduction in performance and also the appearance of symptoms that can be attributed to attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity. In their further research, Martin Taisha and Angelika Pariga found that girls and boys are at different ages have different sensitivities when it comes to witnessing violence. When it comes to witnessed violence between parents, girls and boys between the ages of 0 and 5 and 13 and 15 years are similarly sensitive. Boys are significantly more sensitive between ages 6 and 12, and girls slightly later between ages 15 and 18. If violence is observed against siblings, both are similarly sensitive between, while girls are then significantly more sensitive than boys from the age of 6. However, it is also possible to identify the most sensitive phases. For witnessing violence between parents, girls are most sensitive in the phase between 10 and 12 years, boys slightly earlier from 7 to 10 years. For witnessing sibling violence, the most sensitive phase for girls is from 7 to 12 years, and for boys again from 7 to 10 years. The effects of witnessed violence now differ at each stage of development. What should babies and toddlers expect? In addition to increased irritability and jumpiness, sleep disturbances must also be expected. Clinging can also increase significantly as a result of strong separation anxiety. Additionally, witnessing domestic violence so early in life poses a significant risk to later attachment development. When you look at the possible consequences, such as sleep disturbances, jumpiness, and increased clinging, I think it's almost self-explanatory that this won't exactly reduce the tension within that relationship. For school children, serious problems in emotion regulation and, as a consequence, often increased deviant behavior arise. Psychosomatic complaints also increase, such as the classic abdominal pain in the morning. Particularly problematic are the feelings of guilt that develop so early in life and then possibly become so typical in much later relationships of their own. Already at this age, thoughts such as "I'm to blame for my man getting beat up" can form, very similar to the self-recriminations of sufferers then later on. The consequences then became more complex for school children. At this age, metacognitions and thus reflections become more clearly possible. These lead above all to feelings of shame and the formation of low self-esteem. Very closely related to this is the tendency to guard this family secret, for example, not to betray either the person affected or the perpetrator. This then leads very quickly to isolation and social withdrawal. Children of this age often seek explanations for the observed events, which can lead to an inadmissible attributions and, especially in the case of boys, to identification as the perpetrator. The direct consequences of this are then difficulties in their own social relationships and possibly the development of aggressive behavior. Performance problems at school also frequently occur at this age, often also seemingly inexplicable drops in performance. One of the most difficult consequences for adolescents is emotional and instrumental parentification. In some cases, this may well occur earlier. This taking on responsibility too early, the feeling of being responsible for things in order to take the burden and pressure of the mother, often with the feeling of failure if it doesn't work out, often has fatal consequences. This also very quickly leads to young people feeling responsible for protecting them. This excessive demand then often leads to the young people wanting to break away from the parental home far too quickly or almost not managing this necessary developmental step at all. As consequences, the danger of substance abuse or serious disturbances in the development of one's own intimate relationship can be observed at this time in particular. After quite a few considerations, facts and figures, what does this mean in practice? Children do not have the directly affected by domestic violence for them to face significant consequences. Mere observation is enough, as Martin Taisha's findings clearly demonstrate. It is thus clear from these considerations that witnessing domestic violence against caregiver has clear psychological consequences for the child. The statement, "he never attacked the child, never did anything to him," may be true. However, the child inevitably witnesses this and bears the consequences. It may be indirect violence, but it also has consequences. Thus, the witnessing can probably not be in the best interest of the child. There is no doubt that even in the case of separation, contact with both parents is important for the child's psychological development. However, a few excesses must be taken into account. Living in a violent relationship for a very long time has a very big impact on the self-image and the self-worth of the person affected. Breaking out of such relationships is incredibly difficult. Very often, there's also a lack of confidence in one's own abilities to survive without one's partner. That's no wonder when you have heard nothing else for years, but that you're incapable and good for nothing. In this phase, even short and accompanied confrontations with the partner again represent a certain danger that the familiar and the parent's security again seems very tempting. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Beck, for this very comprehensive diagnostic of the impact of violence in children. And I think that it's very, very eye-opening, all the information that you have presented. So now we will head up with our presentations. It will be the time for Janine Sarson and Linda McDonald. They will focus on psychological non-state torture violence of women. Linda and Janine are grassroots supporters of women who survive non-family and family-based non-state torture victimizations and sexualized exploitations. As feminist, independent scholar researchers, this groundbreaking work began in 1993 as a co-founders of Persons Against Non-State Torture, NST. They are contacted predominantly by women in Canada, the US, UK, Western Europe, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand. Since 2004, they have participated in NGO parallel events at the UN in New York, Geneva, and Vienna. You have the floor.
Thank you. So I'm Linda, and thank you for having us. It's an honor to be here to speak among you. Yes, we are grassroots activists that started 28 years ago. We didn't survive non-state torture. I wasn't sure if we both survived family violence and sexualized assault, but not non-state torture. But because of our expertise, we started working with women, and spoken to thousands of women now who've shared their stories of non-state torture. So non-state torture is the torture that's committed against women and girls, primarily in the work we've done by their parents and other family members, spouses, guardians, human traffickers, the buyers or johns, the pimps and pornographers. And it's in the public or private places, contrary to state torture, which is torture that's sanctioned by the state. And we're talking about a gap. There was a mention of gaps earlier, so we're talking about a gap in the domestic violence or family violence, because most people do not understand or know that non-state torture is as common as it is in families and in other forms of human trafficking and crimes that I identified there. And one of the interventions that we developed in listening to the many different stories of women over the years was to chronicle their stories and ours in a book called Women Unsilenced. We just released the book this year, and it's been a long journey, but it's important that we have it included in a book. And the different forms of non-state torture that we're talking about are things like water torture, which is the same as in state torture, electric shocking, caging, shackling, gang rape. And in relation to femicide, the majority of the women talk about how as children or young persons, they were taught to die by suicide by their own hand, taught by the perpetrators in case they ever dared to tell. So that would be seen as a suicide, but we see it as a conditioned femicide. And we don't really know how many femicides there are around the world that are masked as suicide, when really the perpetrators have taught the women and girls to harm themselves by death. Okay. And here's an example of Elizabeth. She's a woman from the UK, and she is a mother. We're talking about mothers. She is a mother. She was born into a family that tortured her from the time she was tiny. And she was also conditioned to have suicide or femicide. And she was suicidal on a daily basis when we started talking to Elizabeth. She's no longer suicidal, and she is happy and healthy and living a very productive life. But it had to be because she learned the term non-state torture to start naming her own victimization and traumatization. And if you look at her drawing, that's a drawing that Elizabeth did. She does drawings to heal all the different black boxes or all the different experiences of torture that she endured in her life. She had to unbox all those and start sharing them all. And one of the things that is really still stays with Elizabeth is the social exclusion that she feels, because people are still wanting to call what happened to her the caging and shackling and water torture and drugging and all of the other horrific forms of torture that we know about in state torture. They want to persist in calling it abuse. And she does not want it to be called abuse because that's not what she endured. So Elizabeth words explain right there why support systems don't understand. She says, I do speak about torture. Sometimes I feel so isolated, like being in a place and no one talks my language. And I have to keep relating in their language, even though it is not my language. It's a social isolation, difficult to describe. Now, that's one of the interventions we can do as society around survivors of non-state torture, is to believe them and start listening to their stories in full content, because really the social isolation can trigger the conditioned suicide, which then could result in a femicide, and that is a tragedy. And the other thing I wanted to say is Elizabeth is very clear that she's not mentally ill, that she is a victim of a crime and a human rights violation, but she is not mentally ill. Linda and I are sharing our 10 minutes of presentation. And the reason why is that it's important that we speak. It helps us stay healthy. Sometimes we forget that we can recommend to others to speak about their victimization, but it's also very important for Linda and I to know that it keeps us healthy by sharing our 28 years of helping women and sharing the time together so that neither one of us are silenced. So that's an intervention around self-care. So this slide, often when we're listening and people are speaking to us and we talk about violence against women, what does the violence mean? And when we talk about non-state torture, people will, just like Elizabeth said, when I say torture, people will say abuse. And she says, no, it's not abuse. I'm talking about torture. So we understand that individuals may not understand clearly what a woman is saying when she's talking about being tortured by private individuals or non-state actors. So this diagram is one to try to explain what that means. So when we talk about physical torture, it seems that we do understand. We understand what somebody being burnt with cigarettes. We understand if somebody was sliced with a knife. We understand the physical ramifications of physical torture, but for the population that we have supported and helped heal, we also know that the physical torture often goes into sexualized torture. So when we see physical torture, sexualized torture, sometimes those links aren't made. So this is what this diagram is meant to do. So we have the physical torture of burning, how the perpetrators of non-state torture translate that into sexualized torture. Here are some examples. One woman, when she was a little girl, they inserted a hot light bulb into her vagina. So that's a burning. If we don't know these realities, we have gaps in our knowledge. Another woman had a hot poker inserted into her vagina. And smothering sticks, whatever gives the perpetrator pleasure. And that is another topic, emotional topic of the MO of the perpetrators that often is not talked about, is how much pleasure they have in what they do. And the women tell us that from the time they were little girls. They say they know that the perpetrators were having pleasure, besides the money they make if they traffic them and the power they have over controlling life and death. So when we're talking about the psychological, it's to understand where the psychological consequences come from. So in this model is to show the physical burning, the sexualized burning, and how much terror, emotional terror, the psychological torture commits. You know, they're just frozen in the terror. And the torture, pain, and suffering, the fear and the terror that they're going to be tortured further, that just accents the terror. And of course, when they start telling their stories, often their body has cellular memory, and their bodies will replay the physical and the sexualized torture that they survived, and their body will play it out. So when they're trying to heal, the terror comes back, the fear that their body will start what they call torturing them all over again. And of course, there's the damage and the shame that comes if they go for medical care and there's physical damage to have to explain that it was their family or their spouse or a family friend. So it's to understand the psychological terror there. So another example is cutting. We seem to understand the physical torture of cutting, but women tell us that knives were used to rape them and to cut them. So the terror, again, the psychological terror that if perpetrators decide to have a knife in hand, what might happen? The terror comes again. So it's understanding where the psychological consequences come from and to make the links between the physical, the sexualized, and the psychological. And for example, under the cutting, one woman had part of a breast nipple cut off and some tissue. And like she said, when the doctor said, "What happened to you?" she said she was so shame-based to say that it was her family that did it. So the terror and the fear and the shame come again, all of a consequence of what the victimization they survived. So under the third one, the physical torture, choking and strangulation, a rope around a woman's neck can go into unconsciousness. And when they're unconscious, women say that they woke up, they knew they were being raped, and held in a cage with a rope around their neck, and they can't escape. So that explains the psychological sense of powerlessness. They have no recourse. So the terror and the powerless comes again. The terror, they will die, the psychological pain and suffering about what is being done to them. And like Linda mentioned, some of the girls, as little girls, easily as toddlers, were taught to kill themselves, if you will, if they ever told on what was being done to them. So like Linda said, conditioned femicide. And actually, I see Michael holding, I guess it was the latest edition of Femicide, and we have written in the journal Femicide, and we talk about the conditioned femicide. And also the risk to femicide with strangulation that could happen present or could be delayed. And sometimes we don't understand that with strangulation, there can be damage to the carotid artery that might not show up for a week or a month. So the whole concept of understanding femicide, we have to understand clearly and name the gap of the type of violence that's being committed against women and girls. And in this case for us, in 1993, there wasn't even a word like non-state actors. So we struggled for quite a few years, actually, before we understood globally from the UN level, like in 2008, when the Committee Against Torture talked about non-state actors and that some of the violence women and girls suffer amounts to torture. And the other intervention I'd like to talk about is the difference between victimization, traumatization, informed care, and trauma-informed. This is really very important for the women that have survived non-state torture. We don't know about women who have survived domestic torture that doesn't amount to torture, domestic violence that doesn't amount to torture. But for the women who have been tortured, they tell us that sometimes no one has ever said to them that what they suffered was a crime, that a crime was being committed against them. And when they know that, they've told us that it removes shame. It removes the fact that somehow there was something wrong with them. So we're encouraging people to identify the crime and let women know that it was a crime that was committed against them. And that helps build their resilience. When we want to find ways to be helpful, building resilience is really important. Like we gave a webinar one day and a woman said for 30 years she'd been going to therapy and nobody ever told her that the sexualized victimization she had survived was a crime. So that's why we try to show the difference between language, the language we use versus like victimization, traumatization, informed care. And the reason we say that too is because we know that over our 28 years of helping women heal from being tortured, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, because what happens, they normalize their life. When it starts when they were little tiny babies, they normalize their relationships. So it becomes quite a surprise to them in some ways when they start realizing that it was a crime that was committed against them that they normalized. And their suffering, the psychological suffering, is a consequence of the criminal victimization. So we just wanted to identify with trauma-informed. It doesn't have to be a crime committed against a person. It could be a natural disaster. There's natural disasters going on in the world, you know, from Australia and the burning, and Canada right now, we have massive floods. In Europe, there's been floods. So there does not necessarily have to be a crime to have trauma, emotional, psychological trauma. So the other point I want.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
If you could start wrapping up because we are running out of time. It's
Okay.
very, very important and very, very interesting, and what you are presenting. But still, we are still having another panelist. Thank you very much, and sorry for this interruption.
Yeah, sorry. The only point I want to make is connecting to the UNODC, that some of these women were also trafficked outside of their country as well as inside their country. So it's important to know that it's a global crime. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And especially for making awareness in this very, very tough situation of non-state torture, because as you said, it's particularly degrading and extremely terrible for the victims. So thank you very much for highlighting this. Now, Ana Albasi del Frate will be the next panelist and last, but not least, and her presentation will focus on measuring psychological violence against women from Alliance of NGO on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. Ana Albasi del Frate is the chair of the Alliance of NGO on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice and an honorary advisor to the board of the Organización de Familias de Asia do Pacífico. She spent 20 years working as research officers for the UN, UNICE, and UNODC, plus 9 years at the Small Arms Survey in Geneva, of which she was research director and director of programs. She holds a PhD in criminology and has vast experience in global studies on crime prevention and criminal justice, with a special focus on gender-related matters. Ms. Ana Albasi del Frate, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you. And sorry, I will be the last speaker, so I will try to avoid repeating what has already been said by previous speakers. So I hope that you can see the screen. We are going back to the very beginning. We heard from Minister Zadic the point of data collection, the importance of data collection. And when we talk about these issues, we always go from two extremes. On the one hand, there is the need to account and register each and every form of victimization, including acknowledging each person who is the victim. And on the other extreme, there is the need to quantify and provide aggregated and detailed information on the extent of the phenomenon. So that that could also inform programs and prevention strategies. So the issues we have been discussing today, we heard from several presentations. There may be also a matter of terminology. terminology now that is internationally used includes basically three forms of violence. There is physical, sexual, and psychological violence. We talk about these three forms of violence also in the indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. This is terminology that, of course, cannot include everything, but it's important to take into account what can be included. What I always think, talking about psychological violence, is that many of the behaviors that are included in this category are so apparently remote and removed from femicide, from the actual killing of a person, that it must be possible to engage a larger group of people, to engage more the educational sector, the people who have to do with free time, leisure, sports, for example, to make sure that some of these issues are addressed longer before they become so dangerous for people. We have talked about these different issues, and the Istanbul Convention that has already been mentioned before is the first legally binding instrument that talks specifically about psychological violence and stalking in Articles 33 and 34. And then, of course, it includes also physical violence and other very specific forms of violence. But as you know, what is defined by law can be measured. And being a legally binding instrument, this is the first one that provides this detailed breakdown, therefore allowing for data collection on specific forms that are well defined in a legal instrument. Talking about this, again, I always go back to psychological violence because it's something that is frequently neglected in the measurement, because it's quite complicated. It is a very broad area, and it includes so many different forms. It generates feelings that we have just heard, both from the neurological and psychological point of view from the previous presentations. And it's very difficult to capture because sometimes people who are affected from these forms of violence, they don't acknowledge it. So it is very difficult also to measure these phenomena. How do we go about measuring? It is mostly done through surveys. So surveys that are personal interviews with women, and over the years very sophisticated methodologies have been developed to collect data on large samples of women. The most important principle is that the interview, the data collection should not really generate harm, because in some cases it is possible to damage the person by asking certain questions. If certain questions, very sensitive questions, are asked in the presence of family who may be actually the perpetrators of these forms of violence, then the woman may be in danger. So the development of these methodologies has been the focus of quite a lot of work, especially done by WHO and the UN Population Fund. There is now quite detailed manuals and methods to carry out not only the interviews, but to train the interviewers, including debriefing interviewers after some interviews that may be very deep and bringing quite a lot of emotion. And the different questions, they touch on many aspects of psychological violence. Here in this slide, by the way, you will be able to get this presentation because it will be posted on the website. Some of these aspects are sort of bells that should be ringing in some, let's say, in some couples, in some relationships, because there is a form of, for example, of economic violence that is just a deprivation of access to information about finance and the possibility to make decisions, and some controlling behaviors that are about seeing people or family or the possibility to complete schools, etc. And then it continues with more serious forms such as abusive behaviors and threatening behaviors, and finally behaviors that are specifically important for mothers, and they are about threatening to take the children, threatening to hurt the children. And actually it is something that we have already seen in the specific forms of violence against mothers. The extent, so just to give you a couple of figures that are taken from two surveys recently carried out in Europe. The Fundamental Rights Agency of the EU in 2014 carried out a survey in all EU countries, and basically the result was that 43% of the women they interviewed who had either a partner or a previous partner had been suffering some form of psychological violence, including different forms among those that I listed before. And recently also the OSCE carried out a survey in 8 Southeast European countries where they found even a larger prevalence. 60% of women suffered some form of psychological violence. So what to do? The possible response strategies are the same that are foreseen for violence against women. There is this initiative of 6 UN agencies and the World Bank, the Respect initiative that is about promoting quite a broad approach touching empowerment of women and services and reduction of poverty, making safe environments and preventing children abuse, and working on the skills and the actually in the cultural norms and the transformation of the beliefs and the attitudes. And one example is a strategy, a specific strategy that is an action plan developed by Denmark over 4 years for the prevention of psychological and physical violence in intimate relationships. So there are some specific initiatives that some countries have already started for this. I would finally say that the civil society that I'm honored to represent in Vienna with the Alliance of NGOs in Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice has a very important role in obviously in documenting the issue. We have, for example, among our members, many that are involved in providing support services and shelter to victims. We recently carried out a survey among our members where we found that this is the focus of many of them. And civil society is crucial for its independent contribution and the possibility to participate in the development and monitoring of strategies and action plan to make sure that there is practical outcome and sustainable results for victims and for the entire population. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ana Albasi, for your presentation. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Republic of El Salvador, Her Excellency Julia Emma Villatoro Tario. She will give the concluding remarks of this event. Ms. Ambassador Julia Villatoro has been Ambassador of the Republic of El Salvador to the Federal Republic of Austria and Permanent Representative to the United Nations and other international organizations in Vienna. She previously served as Ambassador to the Kingdom of Belgium and to the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, while being the head of mission of the Republic of El Salvador to the European Union in Brussels. Prior to joining the Foreign Service, Ambassador Villatoro Tario participated in the drafting of the procedural legislation that enabled the implementation of El Salvador's Authority on Competition. Given her tenacity, integrity, and outstanding performance in the field of competition, Ambassador Villatoro Tario was a recipient of an award that allowed her to gain first-hand experience as an expert lawyer at the Products and Brand Division at the Swiss Competition Commission. Furthermore, Ambassador Villatoro Tario possesses a vast experience as professor and lecturer in her native country, El Salvador. You have the floor, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ambassador. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is my pleasure to be here today. Many thanks for the invitation to participate in this important event jointly organized by the civil societies through the Sigmund Freud University and NGOs and the Unodc. I also appreciate very much the opportunity to make some closing remarks. I have to say that this task has not been easy. All panelists have presented in their own point of view related to their professional and academic background, relevant information and data regarding this important topic. Congratulations to all of them and many thanks for your contributions. Due to the lack of time, I won't repeat the objective of this meeting. Having in mind this, my closing remarks are as follows. The panelists agree on the serious consequences that femicide and violence in all its forms leave in the victims. Criminals should be prosecuted and criminalized. Many times the perpetrators are their partners or members of the family of the victims. Regrettably, the current statistics show that violence against women and girls are high and continue increasing daily. Respect of human rights is important in combating this crime, but also the victims need to be attended. The psychological, physical, and neurobiological damages caused to women and girls, but also to children who witness any form of violence need to be treated in an adequate way. The consequences children may have in different areas of their lives, emotional, educational, and socially, are of high impact. Women are also victims of psychological or physical non-state torture violence, NST, and it is important to understand about the difference between abuse and torture, which is happening more frequent than we may know. This modality certainly has also effects in the victims like shame, fear, terror, and trauma, for example. Unfortunately, it has been also demonstrated that during the COVID-19 pandemic, the number of cases of violence against women, girls, and children increased. To take action, understanding the meaning of violence, including domestic violence, which unfortunately is committed frequently, might not be only physical, but also psychological, verbal, sexual, among others. We must act and prevent it. To do so, the collection of data is an important tool. Data should be collected on solid, reliable, and comparable basis to be analyzed in a good manner to contribute to identify risk factors of this threat. Unodc has already supported the issuance and update of standards, norms, and resolutions in this field, which are available online to be consulted, as well as technical assistance tools that might be used by member states. Likewise, other institutions and NGOs have also made surveys, studies, and compiled data to show the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the impact on this violence committed during the different situations that have been presented. The adoption of implementation of tailor-made policies in this regard is of utmost importance, such as national plans, legislations, programs, creation of institutions dedicated to address this matter. The experience of some countries, like we heard of Mexico, have demonstrated the important role an observatory dedicated on femicide issues may play to tackle the violence against women. The contribution of the civil society in this area is very important. Therefore, the engagement with it is fully encouraged. A call to member states to sign and ratify international instruments on the subject was also highlighted, as well as to assist countries in their effective implementation. Furthermore, the lessons learned from existing efforts is essential to combat femicide, psychological, and physical violence. Having said this, we certainly have heard that governments and civil society have already reacted to these new challenges. However, much remains to be done. That's why I strongly encourage all of you to continue making efforts to stop this threat. There are many girls and women and children that urgently need our support. Every one of us can do something at our own level. Let's do it. Once again, many thanks to the organizers, to the panelists, to the moderator, my colleague of Mexico, Ambassador Campuzano, and to all the attendees for your interest in this event. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Villatoro, and we're reaching already the end of the meeting. And I would like only to once again thank the organizers, the panelists, and the participation of all who attended this podium, because many very important things have been presented here today. And well, as my colleague just said, and also Dr. Platzer, la lucha continua. Thank you very much and good evening.